Hi, my name is Ren and welcome back to my booktube channel. So today I thought we would embark on a quest together during this drizzly November to also read a book that begins on a drizzly November. And if you couldn't tell by the various amounts of whale paraphernalia around me, including my whale slippers, my whale tail necklace, Moby sitting here, and also my Starbucks drink, we are in fact rereading Moby-Dick. Moby-Dick is one of my favorite novels of all time. I first read Moby-Dick a couple years ago, and since then I have become obsessed with whales. Perhaps not to the extent, hopefully, that Ahab, the captain of the Pequod, was obsessed with Moby-Dick, but similarly, I think Moby-Dick, the novel, and whales, accordingly, and Melville have a really special place in my heart. I will confess that I had a little bit of a slower reading week this week, so I only read the first half of Moby-Dick, and then next week's video will be the second half, and hopefully that will be a little bit more coherent takes. I have no real plan for this video except to just yap about and fangirl about Moby-Dick, at least the first half, for those who don't know what Moby-Dick is generally about. It's basically narrated by a man named Ishmael, who, as you may know from one of the most famous opening lines of the literary canon, "Call Me Ishmael." So basically this guy who's not really skilled and he is kind of bored basically with life, he decides to kind of on a whim go on a whaling journey. He goes out and gets hired to work on the Pequod, which is this whaling vessel who is captained by Captain Ahab. And what is, ostensibly just a, whaling vessel, they're trying to get sperm whales because sperm whales specifically are used, the oil is used for like lamps and stuff like that. It's more of a cover for Ahab's true mission on this journey, which is to kill Moby-Dick, which is a white whale that bit off his leg. Ahab harbors this like deep resentment against this one specific white whale. Sperm whales are not usually white. And it's just basically about that whaling, just that one whaling voyage from the time that Ishmael decides to go off on this journey and into the final kind of sort of encounter with Moby-Dick. The best description of Moby-Dick that I have found is by Melville himself in chapter 45, where he says, quote, "This man and this whale again came together, and one vanquished the other." What I really love about sort of this ostensibly very simple narrative is that it is as multifaceted and varied as the ocean. You have these shallows that are fun to splash around in, these sort of bad dad jokes that Ishmael is always cracking. He dips into sort of kind of unserious descriptions of like whale cetology or the funny characters that he encounters on his voyage. But at the same time, there's an incredible depth to Moby-Dick. It is a layered story. There's countless debates on what Moby-Dick truly means. Is it an allegory for the American dream? Is it, a meditation on the clash of fate and free will? Is it, examining into the interior of one man in Ahab's obsession to his detriment, to chase this one singular goal of revenge that he has? Is it a story that looks at ambition and about this man who is quite literally the incarnate of the Shakespearean phrase, vaulting ambition that overleaps itself from Macbeth, and the consequences of it? I think the answer is yes to all of them. It is as simple and as profound as this whaling voyage. I think Tolstoy said that all novels are just essentially variations of two narratives. One is a stranger coming to town or a protagonist setting off on a quest. And this is like the quintessential quest novel. What I love so much about Moby-Dick is the ability for it to capture all of this variety, as varied and multifaceted and wide and deep as the sea is. It's funny because he does it in very self-effacing ways. Specifically, he said, "So ignorant are most landsmen of some of the plainest and most palpable wonders of the world, that without such hints touching on the plain facts, historical and otherwise, of the fishery, they might scout at Moby-Dick as a monstrous fable, or still worse and more detestable, a hideous and intolerable allegory." Which I think is funny because Moby-Dick is both a fable and an allegory. And I think Melville kind of plays with this idea that he pokes fun at this idea that there is deeper meaning to Moby-Dick, and yet the book is rife with multifaceted meaning that honestly I don't think you can solely characterize it just as one thing, and that's why I think it has kind of stood the test of time as one of the most beloved, I think, novels of the American canon and just like the literary canon in general. I figured that I would start with this beautiful edition. So I got this book. Isn't this a beaut? I got this book at the last bookstore in Los Angeles, and I just love it so much. And so the dedication is, in token of my admiration for his genius, this book is inscribed to Nathaniel Hawthorne. I think that's so cute. So Herman Melville and Nathaniel Hawthorne had like author friendship. Herman Melville read one of Nathaniel Hawthorne's like lesser known novels and like completely fell in love with it, basically wrote this like rave review love letter to that novel, and they became fast friends. During the time that Herman Melville was writing Moby-Dick, he was really influenced by this friendship that he had with Nathaniel Hawthorne, and you can search online for the letters that they wrote to each other, Melville's being the only remaining letters, but I just love author friendships, and specifically authors that are writing letters to other authors about their lives, their loves, but also just like the novels that they're writing. That to me is really fun. Another example of this that I really like is Aldous Huxley's letter to George Orwell after the release of 1984. Aldous Huxley had released Brave New World and was basically just like, hey, like, good job on your novel, but my vision of the world in the future is more accurate than yours for X, Y, and Z reasons, which I think is just such an Aldous Huxley thing to do. Anyway, but I love that, just author friendships in general, and that was just like a fun little fun fact. So then we get to the contents of the book. There are 135 chapters. What I like about Moby-Dick is that for as long of a book this is, it's not too long, I would say. It's like less than 600 pages. So it's not like the worst, but I will say for as long it is, the chapters are really short. And I think that helps with the pacing of the novel. It doesn't feel like it drags on at all. And I think it actually feels like a very fast read because the chapters are very discrete. And Melville jumps a lot between what he likes to talk about. Anyway, so we finally get to chapter 1, which begins, Call Me Ishmael. What is the motivation for Ishmael starting off on this voyage? Practically nothing, except, quote, whenever I find myself growing grim about the mouth, whenever it is a damp, drizzly November in my soul, then I account it high time to get to the sea as soon as I can. I love that phrase, whenever it is a damp, drizzly November in my soul. I think we all can kind of relate to that sentiment, and I think during this damp and drizzly November, I also wanted to go on a voyage, and so thus, as Ishmael starts his voyage out into the Pequod, we also begin our voyage through Moby-Dick. Speaking of, I think there's a really interesting kind of link between the way that Moby-Dick is viewed in popular culture and as a sort of like leviathan itself of a novel. Like, I think when people ask me what my favorite novel is, I hesitate to say Moby-Dick because it just sounds super pretentious. But something that I feel very strongly, especially now rereading this novel, especially the first half, is that this book is really approachable. Like, it's surprisingly so. I was immediately struck upon first reading it how fun and slightly unserious that Melville through Ishmael is as a narrator. He's making crass jokes, he is making like weird puns, and he's just kind of talking about how he was bumming around, wants to find a voyage, set sail on the Pequod, and like his observations as he's at sea. And I think it's interesting that Moby-Dick as a novel has become a sort of leviathan in our modern consciousness, even though I think that the novel itself, the contents of the novel, are far from intimidating or unintelligible or highfalutin in any sort of way. I think there are certainly novels that are difficult to read, Ulysses being a sort of example of that, but this is not that. I would characterize it in my brain as one of the comfort novels that I would read. I want to point out some of my favorite chapters of the first half of the book. One of my favorite chapters is chapter 32 called Cetology, and he basically just departs from his usual narrative of the story to tell you facts about whales, specifically like whale anatomy, different types of whales, etc. And so he basically just breaks out into it being like kind of a science textbook, except for the fact that it's not really scientifically accurate. So he's taking a little bit of like creative license with the science. He calls moby-dick, the whale, a fish a lot, which we know not to be true. But just because in previous references like Jonah and stuff like that, it's called like the fish. And so he just wants to keep that vibe, I guess, going. Chapter 32 begins really beautifully. Already we are boldly launched upon the deep, but soon we shall be lost in its unshored, harborless immensities. Ere that come to pass, ere the Pequod's weedy hull rolls side by side with the barnacle hulls of the leviathan. At the outset, it is but well to attend to a matter almost indispensable to a thorough appreciative understanding of the more special leviathantic revelations and allusions of all sorts which are to follow. First, what I really like about this is that Ishmael is really conscious as a narrator of the fact that he is telling you a story, and so he brings you along the story. And this is an example of it, where he directly addresses basically the reader and uses this sort of plural possessive where he's like, we, us, let us embark on this journey, which I think creates a sense of intimacy between the narrator and the reader that I don't think is sometimes present in other novels. This chapter is just him like waxing poetic about whale anatomy, but he describes the fact that he's not actually going to be super scientifically accurate, which I think is really hilarious because he dedicates an entire chapter to a non-scientific scientific study of whales. He says, quote, "My object here is simply to project the draught of the systematization of cetology. I am the architect, not the builder." So he basically just like eschews all responsibility of like correct cetology by just saying that he's an architect. And so he's basically, I feel like this is Melville's way of just saying that he's going for vibes. Something that I really like. Also, there are pictures. So it's basically a picture. Moby-Dick is basically just a picture book about whales. But one of my favorite things is it's kind of unserious. So here. So in book 3, he says he's explaining a different type of porpoise, and he calls it the huzzah porpoise. So it says, quote, "I call him thus because he always swims in hilarious shoals, which upon the broad sea keeps tossing themselves to heaven like caps with a 4th of July crowd." While he's giving this kind of supposedly serious explanation of all of the whales and their anatomical features, he just calls this random porpoise a huzzah porpoise because he feels like he wants to huzzah when he sees it. I think that's just fun. I don't know. I think another thing that Melville does really well is connect nature, like Mother Nature, to human nature. And specifically, as he takes observations of what's around him, it reveals a deeper meditation of the interior of someone's brain. Here's an example of this. So in the beginning of chapter 36, it says, "It was not a great while after the affair of the pipe that one morning shortly after breakfast, Ahab, as was his wont, ascended the cabin gangway to the deck." Then he says, "Soon his steady ivory stride was heard, as to and fro he paced his old rounds. Did you fixedly gaze too upon that ribbed and dented brow, there also you would see still stranger footprints, the footprints of his one unsleeping, ever-pacing thought." Ishmael is asking the reader if, as they see, through imagery, Ahab pacing the deck, if they could also see the sort of pacing that's going on in Ahab's mind as he's singularly focused on his one task of revenge. And that, to me, is an example of how well and masterfully that Melville uses shifting focalization, but also this interplay between what is seen and what is unseen. Another chapter that I really like is chapter 42, called The Whiteness of the Whale. Moby-Dick is a white whale, and you might be wondering why. And it doesn't give an explanation for why Moby-Dick is a white whale, but it does give a sort of explanation of why whiteness of the whale is in fact sort of more ominous or foreboding than perhaps a regular color would be. And Melville, or through Ishmael, muses, "Is it that by the indefiniteness it shadows forth the heartless voids and immensities of the universe, and thus stabs us from behind with the thought of annihilation while beholding the white depths of the Milky Way? Or is it that as in essence, whiteness is not so much a color as the visible absence of color, and at the same time, the concrete of all colors. I think that's just really beautiful, the duality of the color white as both the infiniteness of possibilities and also the lack of color and meaning to begin with. And so Melville specifically does a really good job at portraying these dichotomies. And so you get this duality of one man who has no meaning in life and is just kind of, going about this whaling journey in a quest to find meaning, while on board a ship that is captained by a man who has only one singular meaning in life, one purpose that he has dawned upon himself and will go to any lengths, quite literally circumnavigate the globe for the off chance of finding this one whale in the entire ocean and killing it. We get this also in the contrast between the first mate and the second mate. Fun fact that Starbucks is actually taken from Starbuck, who is the first mate in Moby-Dick. A note on rereading. I am a rereader. That's just like my reading style. I think I sacrifice, for as much as I read, I tend to sacrifice breadth for depth. My favorite thing to do is to reread a novel. I love to read a novel for the first time, but I think that there is an acute pleasure in rereading something and having it grow with you. The experience of rereading a novel is never the same. Even though the novel is stagnant in a sense, they're, text, printed words on a page, it is such a breathing and dynamic thing to have the joy of experiencing a story multiple times as you grow, as your understanding of the world, the situation that you're in, how you re-encounter or encounter the book is one of my favorite things of I think the written expression specifically. I think that there are certain other mediums that prioritize just having the ephemeral nature of art. Theater, for example, is a medium in which there is something really special about how inherently ephemeral that performance is, and that performance will never be again. But for me, I feel that the ephemeralness of a book is heightened by its enduringness. And so even though the words on the page will always be the same and will endure for all of posterity, I think that our experience each time that we read a novel is so incredibly ephemeral and in the moment. And I think that in my everyday life, rereading something is the closest to time travel that I can get. I think rereading a novel and coming across favorite words or phrases that I remember or loved the last time around is kind of like that serendipity and joy of meeting an old friend on a street. You know when you are not expecting to meet them and you see them across the way and you just shout at them, get really excited, and run up to them, embrace them in a hug. That familiarity coupled with the novelty, the serendipity, I think that is my experience and has been my experience of rereading in general, but specifically by this week of rereading Moby-Dick. In conclusion, I just had a lot of fun rereading the first half. I think I don't have any particularly enlightened things to say about it, except that it was just a really good time. I'm excited to read the second half this week, and after that, hopefully I'll provide you a little bit more of a cogent review of the novel. But in the meantime, thanks so much for coming on this journey with me, muddling through my sort of stream of consciousness narration of what I thought and liked most about the first half. If you do end up reading it or have read it, would love to hear what you think. And hope you are staying warm during this drizzly November, and I will see you next week.